I used to have a ground floor apartment that was part of a large 15-story building. It was one of the more affordable places in my area, which is why I got it. The other units mostly had balconies, but being on the ground floor, mine didn't. It did have 2 large windows facing southwest, so I got a lot of late-day sun. Since the building didn't have air conditioning, it got pretty hot in the afternoons, especially in the summer. I had been there for about a year when this happened, and I still hadn't met most of my neighbors because it wasn't a very friendly place. I was working in the city at the time, and my commute was about an hour. I was really only home for a few hours before going to bed. There was one guy I noticed though. He lived on the far end of the hallway from me, which I knew because I had seen him going in and out before. Other than that, I had no idea who he was. He looked older than me. I was 24, and he was probably around 50. He was a shorter guy, but stocky and looked reasonably strong. My apartment was small, and it was just a single room. You could call it a bachelor or a studio, but the point is that there was no bedroom. There was a small corridor leading to the front door, with closets on both sides, and there was the bathroom, which was a separate door too. Other than that, my bed was on the side next to one of the windows, while the kitchen was in the other corner. I had been going about my routine in that place, when one Friday night, I came home late. I had gone out with a friend after work, so it was about 10 in the evening. As soon as I got into the hallway, I saw that neighbor of mine standing on the other end, looking down towards me. I quickly unlocked my door and went inside. I wasn't scared at that point, or uncomfortable, just not wanting to be around anyone. There was nothing to suggest he was dangerous at the time, so I didn't worry. About 10 minutes later, I brushed my teeth and I was getting ready to go to bed. Just then, I heard the knob on my front door turn. I was startled and stopped what I was doing, careful not to make a noise. When I looked into the hall through the peephole, I didn't see anything. Then I opened the door and looked down the hall. My neighbor was walking away towards his place. As my head was poked out, I saw him turn around and look back. I pulled my head back in, but I knew he saw me before I did. I was pretty freaked out by that, but after sleeping on it, I thought it was possible that he just thought it was his place. I was on the same floor after all, and it was a Friday night, so a lot of people would be having some drinks. All those excuses made sense to me at the time, but this is not the end of it. It was a hot night about a month later, and I had opened both my windows as far as they would go to try to keep the heat down. Even after the sun went down, my apartment was really hot. The ceiling fan was on full speed as well. The sound from the street combined with the fan was pretty loud, but it was still better than sweating all night. I went to bed at around 11 as usual, and even though the noise was annoying, I was able to fall asleep. However, I would wake up a few times that night. One time a siren woke me up, but another time, I woke up and saw a person standing at the end of my bed. I screamed some curse words and then grabbed for my phone. The light switch was on the other side of the room, so I used the light on my phone instead. It was that neighbor of mine from down the hall. Seconds after I turned my phone light on, he came at me. We struggled on the floor for a few seconds, and he was getting the better of me. I was reaching around for something to use to defend myself. Eventually, I grabbed a small 5-pound barbell that I keep under my bed. I managed to hit him in the left temple and knock him out cold. He collapsed on top of me, but I managed to squirm out. I ran out of my apartment and outside, barefoot in my sleeping clothes, and then I called the cops. When they got there, my neighbor was gone. I told the cops what happened and where his apartment was. They went and knocked on the door, but nobody answered. I still don't know where he went, whether he was in there or if he had ran off somewhere else. Since they didn't have any solid evidence other than my word, they couldn't make him open the door even if he was there. The next day, I reported it to the building. They pulled up the security camera feed from the lobby, which would have caught the hallway in front of my door. It showed me running out the door when I escaped, but it never showed my neighbor. I know that's because he went out my window, which was open. This is obviously how he got in as well. Due to those details, he got away with it, and I found myself living down the hall from someone who basically tried to kill me. Needless to say, I moved out as soon as possible and found another place. There's no telling what he would have done to me if I stayed. I only hope he never found another victim. This happened in the early 80s. My family moved into a 3-family house. I had 2 daughters. One of them was only 2 years old at the time. When I got to know my neighbors above us, their daughter was the same age as my daughter, and they became good friends. They also had twin boys. The husband was in the Vietnam War and had gone through a lot. Today they call it PTSD. He had a good job and was happy with his boys, but he wanted a girl. When his daughter was born, she had horrible birth defects. It turned out that it was because of the Agent Orange used during the war. This affected the genes of the husband, and it only happens when it's a girl. The twin boys were normal. Because he brought this girl into the world, and because nobody knew this would happen until years after the war, he took to blaming himself and started drinking. He was mad at the world and took it out on everyone when he drank. One night I got a knock on my door. The wife was there. She wanted to stay with my family until her husband fell asleep. It's because he was drunk. After a good hour, he came down pounding on the door. He wanted to know where his wife was. We tried to tell him that she would come back when he sobered up. We told him that she was scared. She was trying to get him to understand so he would leave and go to sleep. He did leave, and I thought he believed us, but we could hear him in the bedroom. However, within an hour, he broke in our door and had a shotgun in his hands. He wanted his wife to get upstairs right away. I was the one in between him and her, and I had a gun pointed at my head. All I remember saying is that I was prepared to die. I'm a saved Christian, by the way. I knew that my husband was still in the bedroom, and he called the cops. When the man saw he wasn't getting anywhere with his bluff, he left, but said he was going to shoot the kids in their beds. The police showed up, and there was a showdown for hours. My family and neighbor went out the back window. We stayed with people down the street. He finally let the kids go, but he was threatening to kill everyone. I don't know how they talked him out of it, but he went to the hospital for help. I'm not sure if this is the right kind of story, but it was creepy when it happened. When I was about 12 years old, I lived in a quiet suburb with my mom and 2 brothers. Our house was a modest 2-story with a decent backyard. It was located near our elementary school, so a lot of our neighbors were other kids who went to my school. It was the late 80s, so we would all hang out together on the block almost every day. We rode bikes, played street hockey, and played hide and seek. When the sun began to dip below the horizon, our parents would shout our names from the front door, and we would have to head back. Kyle was one of my next-door neighbors, and he was a year older than me. We shared a fence and occasionally hung out, but we weren't what you'd call close friends. One summer, however, Kyle and I started hanging out more, maybe because we were so close. Soon, his friend David was around more. He was a kid from a different neighborhood, and I kind of knew him from school already. Whenever he would come over, his mom would have to drop him off, or sometimes he would ride his bike. The 3 of us would wander around the neighborhood, looking for something to do. Our neighborhood had some good parks, and there were some hiking trails in the woods as well, so sometimes we would go in there. One day, Kyle suggested that we explore the woods on the edge of our neighborhood. I didn't bring anything with me, not even a bottle of water, because we were not planning on being out for long. It was only a 20-minute walk from my house anyway. David brought his school bag with him, but at the time I didn't know why. We were in the woods for a while, but eventually we veered off the path because I knew a spot where we could go. There was an old fort that some other kids had built, probably years ago. I thought that would be a good place to hang out. Once we got there, Dave turned away and walked a few meters from us. At first I thought he was going to pee, but when he came back, he had a mischievous grin on his face. When I looked down to his hand, I could see that he was holding a gun. Kyle laughed nervously, and I felt my stomach drop. I had never seen a real gun outside of television and movies. It felt surreal and terrifying. David began waving it around carelessly. Kyle and I were looking at each other and then back to him. I could tell that we were both scared, but neither of us was sure what to do. I remember thinking how quickly things had escalated. It really happened out of nowhere. To be honest, I never really liked David because he scared me. Being around him, I always felt like he was about to smack me, if that makes any sense. He was just unpredictable, and it made me anxious. Anyway, David kept messing with the gun for a while. Neither Kyle nor I had the guts to stop him. Then out of nowhere, it went off by accident. Luckily, it was pointed down at the time, but the sound almost burst my eardrums. All I could hear was ringing for a good 2 minutes afterwards. Birds scattered from the trees above, and David dropped it immediately. We were lucky. The bullet buried itself harmlessly into the ground. As soon as I gathered myself, I could see David holding his hand, and he was hunched over. For a moment, I thought he was hit, but then I found out that he hurt his hand when it went off. Must have been the recoil from the shot, but he actually broke his hand because of it. As we were walking back, it was tense. My ears were still ringing, and I could tell David was fighting back tears. I didn't say a word, because I thought David would flip on me if I said the wrong thing. As we got close to mine and Kyle's area, David turned to me. His expression was serious. "You're not going to tell anyone about this, are you?" he asked. I was taken aback by the question. The thought of telling anyone hadn't crossed my mind. "No, I won't tell," I replied. Kyle nodded too, and then we went our separate ways. From that day forward, things changed between me and Kyle. I later found out that David's dad had caught him for stealing the gun. I'm still not sure how he knew, but there are at least a few ways that I can think of. For one, he would have been able to tell that it was fired. He might have also noticed that it was missing that afternoon, or maybe somebody heard the shot. Whatever it was that gave him away, David became convinced that I ratted him out. He started telling everyone at school that he was going to fight me, and he was spreading rumors. Kyle took his side in all of it. Not that surprising because they were better friends. Whenever David would come to hang out with Kyle, I was always scared. I knew I couldn't take him in a fight, and he was also crazy, so I didn't want anything to do with him. One time when I was in my bed, I heard talking from my backyard. I got up and looked out the window, and I saw David and Kyle standing there in the dark. When I opened my curtains, they must have seen, because they took off right then. One afternoon when I was on my way home from school, Kyle and David cornered me on the street. Without much warning, Kyle shoved me against the wall, then grabbed me tightly by my shoulders. David was standing next to him, then he walked over to me and landed a few punches while Kyle was holding me. I didn't bother trying to fight back, because I was too scared that I would make it even worse. For a good while after that, I was constantly worried that something else was going to happen. I knew for a fact that those two were plotting against me, because people had told me that they were talking about it at school. As the weeks turned into months, though, the bullying eventually subsided. I think one of the teachers at my school found out what was happening and did something. The reasons didn't matter to me. I was just relieved that it was all over. But the incident in the woods and everything else that followed still freaked me out. Fast forward to a few years later, and I was away at college. My mom had moved by then, not too far away, but we didn't live next door to Kyle's family anymore. I don't know what David and Kyle were doing at the time, but over the winter break, I was at a house party. When I was there, I spotted Kyle. He was leaning against a wall, beer in hand, looking not much different than he did in elementary school. At first, I didn't know if I should ignore him or go over and say hi. He seemed to notice me though, and offered a nod. I walked over and said hey, and then we began talking. We talked for a while, but we were carefully avoiding the events of that summer. The conversation was surprisingly easy, and for a brief moment, I saw glimpses of the kid that I used to hang out with before everything went wrong. But the elephant in the room was large, and neither of us dared to acknowledge it. After a few minutes, we went our separate ways, and I never saw him again. If I had to guess, I'd say he felt guilty for what he did to me. He had to know that I didn't tell anyone, but went along with David anyway. I didn't bother bringing it up, because it was in the past. I was over it by then anyway, but I still wonder what happened to David. I'd be surprised if he was doing very well. I used to live with my two friends, Andrew and Vince, and we had a small 3-bedroom house. We had been friends since high school, and I lived with Vince for part of college too. When this story happened, we were 25, and I was working a 9-to-5 job. Andrew was working on his own hustles, while Vince was a student and also driving for Uber. Our neighborhood was not very friendly, because I think most people were renting like we were. Most of the houses were split up, kind of boarding house style. You know when you see a house that has 4 or 5 mailboxes on the front? That's really common on our street. Our house was normal, but that was rare. One of our neighbors a few doors down was something else though. We always joked that it was a drug house. It started off as a joke, but over time, it became pretty serious. I only met those neighbors a few times, but I can say for sure they were into drugs. To be honest, I have some history with that kind of thing as well, so I have an eye for it. I had been clean for over 3 years at the time though. There were several strange incidents relating to those neighbors. One time, I woke up in the middle of the night and went to the bathroom. Then I went downstairs to get a glass of water. When I looked out the window, there was a lineup of 3 cars on the street, all stopped in the middle of the road. It was like they couldn't be bothered to park. This was at 3 a.m. I went to the front window to get a better look and saw 2 sketchy-looking people standing in front of our neighbor's house. I went back to my room and looked out the window to the street. Those cars stayed there for another 10 minutes and then took off. I didn't know what they were up to, but it was quite odd. The next day, I told Andrew and Vince what I saw. They had a few encounters that were similar. We all knew something was going on over there, but we ignored it. Another night, I was jolted awake by an ear-piercing scream that came from outside. I rolled over in bed and looked out my window, which faced the street in front of our house. Peering from behind the curtains, I saw nothing but an empty street. There were streetlights nearby, so I would have seen if there was anything there, but there was nothing within my view. I knew it came from just out there, though. I wouldn't have heard it if it was much farther away. The screaming had stopped as suddenly as it began, then I went back to bed. The next day, we debated whether to call the police, but without more to go on, we didn't bother. I considered moving, but I wasn't making enough to find anything decent at the time. I still didn't think there was going to be any real danger, since everyone kept to themselves. That's why we stayed. We went on with our lives for a while, then one Friday night, we were staying in playing video games in our living room. We had another friend over, so there were 4 of us in total. Our living room was right at the front of the house, and that's where we would play. There was a window leading out to the street, but the curtains were closed most of the time. If you opened them, though, you'd be able to see onto our porch from an angle. It was about 10 at night, and we heard footsteps on the porch. We had invited one other guy over, but we thought he wasn't coming. At first we thought it was him, so I went over to the window to look out. Glancing out the window, we saw a man standing on our porch. It looked like he had a bedsheet draped over his shoulders. In fact, it looked like that's all he was wearing. Then I looked down and saw that he only had one shoe on, so I guess it wasn't just the bedsheet. He stood still, facing the door, as if he was expecting somebody to open it, even though he hadn't even knocked. For over an hour, he stayed there on our porch, but he hardly ever moved the whole time. We eventually called the police because our friend had to go home. His bike was locked up on the porch, and he didn't want to go too close to the guy. Just as officers arrived, the man in the sheet walked away in the direction of our neighbor's house. They went over to talk to them, but only gave them a warning. Not long after that, I was coming home late, and as I walked down the sidewalk, I saw that there were 2 police cars in front of that house. I was approaching from the other side. I never walked right past it, so I never got a clear look. But as I went into our house, I thought they were finally getting busted for whatever they were up to. That must have been what happened, because after that, I never saw them again. After a week or 2, we were pretty sure they were gone. And a month later, someone else had moved into the house. I'm still not exactly sure what they were in trouble for, but my guess is that it was drug dealing. That will attract all kinds of people, and many of the incidents leading up to it were consistent with that kind of thing. What still scares me, though, is that scream that woke me up, because that could be a sign of something really terrible. Could have also been a crazy person freaking out, but we may never know. My friends and I lived in that house for another 3 or 4 years. That neighborhood was a lot better, with those neighbors gone.